Alright folks, welcome back to the Don's channel. I am the Don Father and I'm now going to be doing a request from one of our brand new patrons, Mark Bauer. Thanks very much for being a patron, Mark, and for this request. I hope you'll enjoy my reaction to it. It's going to be a little bit of a sad one. Well, not a little bit, it is going to be a sad one. It's the falling of World War II. It's the cost of the lives that were lost in that war. Of course, the numbers are horrendous. I'm not too sure if they're only focusing on American loss of life during the Second World War, or if it's a grand total of all the cost of all human life within that war. A lot of people don't really see so much when they're looking at World War II the falling on the Eastern Front, obviously we being Western. Obviously America and the United Kingdom and the Allied forces that fought on the Western Front, we kind of focus on that, and also for the Americans, the Pacific as well. But there was quite a huge loss of life on the Eastern Front too, so just huge numbers all in. But as I say, I'm not too sure if this is just going to focus on the US loss of life. But before I start, the link to the original video will be in the description section below, as well all of our other stuff like Patreon. If you want to check that out, that's what Mark did, and he's getting personal requests for videos and also personalised shout out with thanks. So check that out. Anyway then, I'm not going to talk too much because it is about an 18-minute video, and it's going to take some time. I'll obviously have to pause it through the video to talk about what I'm seeing. It is a stat-based video, it's just pointing out facts. So let's just get into it then. No more talking, let's go.
The average lifespan of an American is 80 years, and an 80-year-old today was 10 when World War II ended, 4 when it began. A soldier who saw battle would have to be in his late 80s at least today. Generals, political leaders, the decision makers of the war, few are still with us. And over the past few decades, we've seen authors and filmmakers rush to capture stories from survivors before this connection of memory is lost. This project is not about individual war stories, and it's not about survivors. We're going to tally up the tens of millions of people whose lives were cut short by the war, and see how these numbers stack up to other wars in history, including trends in recent conflicts. We'll be counting soldiers and civilians separately.
Well, there we go.
Each of these figures represents 1,000 people who died. Civilians were of all walks of life, whereas military deaths were almost entirely men. The average age was about 23. In most battles, for every 1,000 soldiers killed, there are more than 1,000 who were injured. The word casualty can be confusing because in military speak, it often includes both deaths and injuries, and anything else that takes a soldier out of service. Here, we're just counting the deaths, and we'll begin with American soldiers.
Wow. And each person
over 400,000 died. Most of the deaths occurred in the European theater, fighting the Nazis. And about a quarter were in the Pacific, fighting the Japanese. When you put them on the timeline, you see that casualties were the heaviest at the end of the war. The war began on September 1st, 1939.
Yeah, well,
but the US wasn't willing to join the fight until Pearl Harbor, 2 years.
I was going to say that.
The deaths increased drastically on D-Day, when the Allies invaded Normandy. One of the most tragic moments of the war was on D-Day at Omaha Beach, where 2,500 Americans fell. So about the same number of US soldiers died on this single beach landing as the entire 13 years of the recent war in Afghanistan.
When you put it like that, it's staggering, isn't it?
The bloodiest battle in the Pacific was Okinawa, which lasted 82 days, during which 12,500 Americans died. About 5,000 of these deaths were at sea from kamikaze attacks.
It's That's absolutely insane.
Now let's look at some other countries, starting with Europe.
Watch that just go. The numbers.
Germany started World War II when it invaded Poland. Poland ultimately lost 200,000 soldiers in the war. Most died after the invasion while the country was occupied by Germany and the Soviet Union. Germany, meanwhile, lost just 16,000 in the invasion of Poland. The Nazis went on to invade and conquer other countries, including Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, France, Greece, and Yugoslavia.
You look at...
France surrendered, but after losing 92,000 soldiers in the Battle of France. Over 200,000 ultimately fell, which includes deaths in POW camps, French colonies, and other fighting. Yugoslavia suffered almost 500,000 military deaths. The initial invasion brought relatively few casualties on both sides, but the deaths mounted under Nazi occupation due to guerrilla fighting, civil conflict, and mass executions. The Nazi invasions were swift, with relatively few German
incredible
losses.
to think how
Even
little...
the Nazi commanders expressed surprise.
It's incredible to think how little they've actually lost in comparison to the countries they invaded. This is at the invasion point. They were a swift, well-drilled, well-oiled machine. They were probably at the time the world's best superpower. And not to be messed with. Technology, it was superior. Training, it was superior. They were just an unstoppable force, or so it seemed at the time. And you look at the loss of life in comparison to Germany during the invasion from just Yugoslavia alone, it's absolutely staggering. This video, although you can see the numbers, obviously it's taken away the actual battle, what it must have been like, the conditions during the invasion, like, was the food cut off, the supply, things like that there. It's just focusing purely on the deaths, and it's quite harrowing in its own right, not actually even hearing the backstories to some of these events.
Their success. And then we have the United Kingdom and the United States, who were not invaded but took the fight to the Nazis. Britain lost about the same number of soldiers as the US, which includes the British colonies. Germany lost about 500,000 soldiers fighting the US and Britain in what is known as the Western Front, which took place in France and Belgium. But most Nazi soldiers died in the Eastern Front.
This is what I was saying.
Germany's unsuccessful invasion of the Soviet Union. The numbers are staggering. The most famous battle of the Eastern Front, and perhaps the turning point of the European war, was Stalingrad. The German 6th Army successfully took Stalingrad, but then got surrounded by the Soviets and cut off from food and ammunition. 500,000 Nazis would ultimately die in Stalingrad. Another 100,000 were taken prisoner, of which 6,000 would ever return. POWs had a low survival rate throughout World War II, and it was particularly grim in the East. When you include these POWs, roughly the same number of Germans died in Stalingrad as all the Western Front fighting against France, the UK, and the US.
Wow.
And though Stalingrad was a victory for the Soviets, they suffered almost twice as many losses as Germany.
In Stalingrad itself, twice as many losses. But altogether...
The Soviet Union would eventually defeat the once unstoppable German army, killing 2.3 million Nazi soldiers.
Holy good God.
But winning the war came at a cost.
Economically, as well as staggering loss of life. This is them winning the war, and look at the loss of life. Far greater than Nazi Germany. It just keeps going. Far greater than Nazi Germany, but they won that war on the Eastern Front. Did they? Did they? Or were the Germans just too stretched?
8.7 million is the official tally by the Russian military, a hotly disputed number. Some studies have calculated as many as 14 million dead.
What?
To complete the count of European military deaths, we need to add German deaths from other fronts, including the North and Africa.
Africa?
as well as deaths from other Axis powers allied with the Nazis: Hungary, Romania, and Italy.
Southeast Asia as well, I would imagine.
When you put these European military deaths on the timeline, it looks like this. You can now interact with the chart to learn more. Pause the narration if you would like more time. And now we switch to civilian deaths in Europe. Six million Jewish people were killed in the Holocaust. If you separate this by country, you see that about half, 2.7 million, were Polish. 700,000 were Soviets, followed by Hungary and 17 other countries. Broken down another way, about half of the 6 million were killed in the concentration camps. Over 1 million died in Auschwitz. Most were killed in the gas chambers. Others died from starvation, exhaustion, disease, and other forms of execution.
Brutally.
The second most deadly camp was Treblinka, which was exclusively an extermination camp, set up to look like a train station.
An extermination camp.
Mobile killing groups
Human
killed
beings.
1.4 million Jews. Like with the gas chambers, men were killed first to reduce the risk of revolt.
Cowards. Absolute cowards. Defenseless human beings.
The Holocaust also includes non-Jewish deaths. Between 130,000 to 500,000 Roma, then called Gypsies, were killed. The numbers are disputed. About 250,000 people with disabilities were killed. Homosexuals, Catholics, and other groups were also exterminated, but their numbers were relatively small. Some historians say that other civilian deaths should go under the label of Holocaust. About 2 million non-Jewish Poles were killed under German occupation, some of which were sent to the gas chambers at Auschwitz. When you combine civilian and military deaths, over 16% of the total Polish population died in World War II, which is the highest percentage of any country. But not the highest in total death count. The Soviet Union again tops that list, losing at least as many civilians as it did soldiers, somewhere between 10 and 20 million. A particularly dark moment for the Soviet Union was the Siege of Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. German forces surrounded Leningrad before civilians could be evacuated. Supplies, including food, were cut off for 2.5 years. 1.5 million people died as a result, mostly from starvation, mostly civilians.
That is just mind-blowing.
Stalin's cruelty towards his own people is partly responsible for these numbers. He often didn't allow civilians to evacuate from cities, thinking it would cause the soldiers protecting them to fight harder. About 1 million Soviets died in Stalin's only regiments, called the Gulag. Just about every country suffered civilian losses, especially countries who were invaded. While many died as a result of so-called collateral damage, the biggest numbers occurred when it was no accident. Civilians were exterminated, purposely fired upon or bombed, used as human shields, or intentionally deprived of food. The intentional killing of civilians was done by most warring parties, including the United Kingdom and the United States. The United Kingdom was spared of a land invasion, but still lost 60,000 civilians, largely from German air raids or blitzes, often directed at civilian population centers.
London, Belfast.
The UK did the same
so
to
many
German
big
cities
cities.
at a much greater magnitude, causing about 10 times the number of deaths. But most German civilian deaths came from the ground at the late stage of the war. When the Nazi regime collapsed, civilians living in occupied regions had to desperately flee from the advancing Soviet army. Rapes were widespread, and death estimates ranged from 600,000 to 3 million.
Fucking pigs, man.
Let's step back and see where we are with the totals.
So the Red
We
Soviet.
just counted about 20 million civilian deaths in Europe. If you add this to the European military deaths we already covered, it brings us to over 40 million. Then we have the Asian theater. Here we see the vast majority of military deaths in Asia, came from China and Japan. On the civilian side, about 6 million deaths from China, Indonesia, Korea, Indochina, and the Philippines can be attributed to Japanese war crimes, which are sometimes compared to the Nazi atrocities due to the sheer scale of the cruelty.
Cruelty being the key word.
China had the second highest death count after the Soviet Union. And like the Soviets, the Chinese government demonstrated a stunning willingness to sacrifice its own people. Chinese nationalists opened the dike at the Yellow River, hoping the flood would halt the Japanese advance. 500,000 Chinese civilians or more were killed, which is 2 or 3 times the number who died in all countries in the 2004 Asian tsunamis.
Is that stupidity or?
But the invasion of China only cost Japan 200,000 soldiers. Most were killed fighting the US and allies in the Pacific War. A significant portion of Japanese civilian deaths were caused by American firebombing and the 2 nuclear attacks. Contrary to official US statements, these airstrikes were directed at civilian populations, not military targets. When you add all the deaths outside Europe, it brings us to a grand total of 70 million for the war, give or take depending on who's counting and what civilian deaths get included.
I would imagine it's north of that, not south.
More people died in World War II than in any other war in history. For comparison, here are 20 or so of the very worst wars and atrocities we have on record. Some of these are more of atrocities than wars, but we've seen how that distinction can get blurry. Some of these spanned across centuries.
American Indians.
World War II had the highest body count, and it all happened in just 6 years.
40 million.
The world's population has grown significantly since the earliest atrocities on this list. If you want to compare them in terms of what percentage of the world died, we can adjust the chart to look like this. This rough approximation tells us there may have been more devastating wars before World War II, proportionally speaking. When we turn to post-war conflicts, it's hard to say anything that isn't controversial. But the data shows something quite extraordinary has been happening. In 1989, John Gaddis coined the phrase the long peace to identify the absence of conflict between the nuclear powers during the Cold War. 25 years later, the Cold War is over, and the term is still being used. Although
long peace is a very exaggerated term there. I think just on the American front, you've had Vietnam, Korea, where was it? Desert Storm, 91, long peace. I'm not too sure there was long peace even during the, well, if you think of the years of the Cold War, there was war. Britain in itself was fighting what would not possibly be labelled as a civil war, but the troubles of Northern Ireland. They've had the Falklands. So long peace, absolutely not, but I'm sure this video will say something else as well in reference to just those 2 countries.
Its meaning may have shifted. European countries have not fought each other, except for this 10-day war in 1956 when the Soviet Union invaded Hungary. When we look at European wars before World War II, it looks like this. They tend to be more frequent as you go back, though smaller in scale. And the largest 44 economies of the world have not battled each other since World War II. Rich countries have fought poorer countries, like the US versus Iraq, but rich countries have not fought other rich countries. Such a period of peace between the so-called great powers hasn't been seen since the Roman Empire. To many, peace is too strong of a word. Wars have occurred since World War II, and they can be grouped into these 4 categories. We don't see colonial wars anymore. We've already noted that interstate wars between rich countries have not occurred at all. And here we see wars involving smaller economies have tapered off. That leaves civil wars of 2 types, with and without foreign intervention. And this is what these battle deaths look like alongside of World War II. More people died fighting in World War II than in all the wars since. And again, we can't forget about world population, which has almost tripled since World War II. If we scale these numbers to show deaths in proportion to world population, showing the likelihood that a person on Earth dies in battle, the downward trend becomes even more pronounced. Now, this isn't to infer anything about why this trend is occurring. That's a discussion for another day. You can now interact with this chart to explore what conflicts are behind the totals. Now bear in mind we're just looking at battle deaths here, not civilian deaths, but those too are in decline. Peace is a difficult thing to measure. It's a bit like counting the people who didn't die in wars that never happened. We give such importance to the word peace.
Exactly right.
But we don't tend to notice it when it occurs, or report on it. Sometimes it takes reminding ourselves of how terrible war once was to see the peace that has been growing around us. Of course, this trend may not continue, and it's not clear how looking at these charts can help us make the right decisions to ensure that it does. But the longer the long peace grows, the more significant it becomes. So if watching the news doesn't make us feel hopeful about where things are heading, watching the numbers might.
I get the sentiment with watching the numbers, and it's a good point, but that's the end of the video. But it takes away the emotion attached to the loss of life, the emotion attached to having loved ones in conflict zones, etc. The aftermath of servicemen, women coming back, people with post-traumatic stress disorder, ultimately then going on and possibly not being able to live anymore and taking their own lives, things like that there. So there's always an aftermath, and it's happened from every conflict. So as much as the numbers, you can look at it in a positive, like which he's trying to do, and I totally get that, and how staggering and upsetting the numbers have been, and I think we can see that there has been a decline on that front with the ever-growing population. There has been a turn in the tide of how many people are needlessly dying in conflicts. But is there a need for conflicts? Well, nobody wants them, but sometimes there is a need for the likes of America, Britain, the elite countries to get involved, because politically a lot of countries have got nutcases in charge of them that are ethnically cleansing or just genocidal maniacs killing their own people, and this sometimes makes it necessary for the big elite countries have to step in and go, whoa, we're putting an end to this now, this isn't right, and ultimately you're losing lives because of it. So yes, we're getting an awful lot of things right, but you're still, rather than just focusing on the numbers, we also need to do a lot more now afterwards in terms of the aftermath. Ex-forces, military people who are coming home, not being looked after, being forgotten about, and pretty much as this video is pointing out, they're being classed as statistics, classed as numbers, and what I'm getting at is that's fundamentally wrong. That is wrong. It's staggering, and the numbers, when you look at it that way, you can focus on the positives, but I think that's the problem with the Western governments these days. They send their troops out there to go to war, to fight, and a lot of the times the soldiers who go out, if they've signed up, they're proud of serving their country, they're willing to possibly give their lives as well. Well, that's what they're doing when they go to these places, they're willing to give their lives, but in the times when they come back and then they leave the military, they are ultimately forgotten about, which is truly shameful. They're forgotten about by the governments, politicians in charge. And let's not forget here, politicians are the ones who start the wars. They start the wars. It's not the general people, it's not the general public. Little Joe Blogs going to his work in a factory, or working down the mines like they might have been, or just working as a joiner or an electrician or something. It's not them that start the wars. These are the people that are going and fighting the wars. It's politicians that start them. So we need to take away this mentality of statistics and numbers, and you're just a number. And now I appreciate you've got a number on your uniform, on your dog tags, but to a lot of people they're more than just numbers. And we need to focus on not just spending a lot of money on the next biggest bomb, the next biggest aircraft, but also on looking after the troops once they come home. It's not good enough that they're being left behind and forgotten about, and in some cases on the streets, homeless, end up on drink and drugs, maybe in prison, and ultimately taking their own lives. So I know I'm going a little bit sidetracked from this, but it's just a point he was making about statistics, and I'm actually countering that with a reason why I think it's a dangerous game as well, to just be so statistical about things. As much as I like the video in terms of facts, as the video states, it takes a lot of the human emotion out of what was happening. I know they said they were doing that, I know, and I appreciate that, but I'm just wanting to remind people of the tragedy of conflict once it's all over and you've no longer got your comrades around you, your comrades around you, people who, your brothers in arms, your boys that you would have spent years with, and then you leave and all of a sudden you're in the civilian world, are left with your own demons in your head and actually no understanding of what is going on or how to deal with it. And I think the military statistics alone should be able to tell them that this is an epidemic, and it's something they need to spend an awful lot more money on, instead of increasing their own wages, getting their second homes in other cities, having homes in different countries, spending the taxpayers' money in all the wrong areas, and start focusing on things like this that means an awful lot to an awful lot of people. But that's my little rant on it over anyway, but the numbers, I'm sure you will agree, were absolutely staggering. I was aware that the Eastern Front, the loss of life, was truly tragic. One thing on that as well with the Russians, they were poorly equipped. They had no, I think in some cases some of them didn't even have boots, so they were taking boots and coats off the enemy dead, off their own dead, to keep warm. So the loss of life, even from a Soviet perspective, was just insane. It's just such a waste of human life. For what reason? Why do these things need to happen? Why did they happen? It's absolutely horrendous, and I'm glad we're living in a world where we say no to all these things. And I think I agree with the sentiment that the US actually has on this one, where they say we believe in peace through power, and to be so powerful that people who are looking to try and maybe take control of things on the planet are deterred by the pure size and scale of the American military and might, that they know that if they dare do anything, then they will be stopped in their tracks. So I do agree with that sentiment, and peace through pure and utter power. It's not even the threat of violence, it's just you are aware of what could potentially happen to you if you're going to get a little bit above yourselves, if you like. But anyway, great video. Thanks very much, Mark, for the request. I really do appreciate it. And if you'd like an individual request, like Mark and like Cody, who I'm going to be doing one for shortly, check out our Patreon account in the description section below on how you can do that. And also our links to our social media accounts such as Instagram. We've got our merchandise as well, and my other channel, The Dawn of World Sports. Thanks very much for watching. I am the Dawn Father, and I'll see you all soon. Goodbye.